Okay, the carved reliefs that decorate the walls of the palace give archaeologists a lot of information in terms of military campaigns that were fought, real historical details, but also depictions of the king as a high priest, a warrior, and also a hunter. And we'll see different examples of this from Nimrud as well as some of the other Assyrian palaces. Okay, so based on the artifacts that were found, we can identify the function of several of the rooms. You'll notice that this very long open room is the throne room. These suites up here were for palace administrators. They found over 400 cuneiform tablets, as well as a set of weights here. There were workshops with tools, a toilet, storage areas, entrance guard rooms, and also storerooms for grain and oil. So, you get the idea that there's a lot of support for what we call staff and personnel and government workers. This is a reconstruction, like a 3D reconstruction of what the palace might have looked like in its prime. Obviously this is what it looks like as it was being excavated. So it gives you an idea. You're walking into the open courtyard, right? You would notice many of the reliefs. We're going to see some of the other carved reliefs, and there would also be inscriptions on the reliefs. Some of the inscriptions, for example, talk about the king, right? The mighty king, king of the world, king of Assyria. His Lord is no equal among the princes of the four quarters of the world. The wonderful shepherd who is not afraid of battle. The king who makes those who are not subject to him submissive, who has subjugated all mankind. The mighty warrior who treads on the necks of his enemies, tramples down all foes, and shatters the forces of the proud. You also get accounts of campaigns and battles. For example, putting down a revolt in Syria. Their men, young and old, I took prisoners. Of some I cut off their feet and hands. Of others I cut off the ears, noses, and lips. Of the young men's ears I made a heap. Of the old men's heads I made a marionette. I exposed their heads as a trophy in front of their city. The male children, the female children I burned in flames. The city I destroyed and consumed with fire. And so this is when an Aramean city was rebelling against the Assyrian Empire. One of the things we'll talk about is one of the tactics, it seems, of the Assyrian Empire was to use overwhelming force, but also use what we might consider terror techniques. That is, not just destroying a city, but causing fear to prevent or, to dissuade any other city from rebelling against Assyria. If they saw what happened to this city, they would be less likely to rebel. So it seems to be a conscious tactic to keep people under domination. Here in the southern suite, you can see this was a living space, probably for the king. And there was also a separate palace for the queens, for the harem. This is where they found a lot of ivory decorations and also some of the burials of some of the queens. So we get an idea of some of the riches of Assyria. This is a subterranean tomb for one of the queens. And you'll notice some of the gold that was found, including this crown and this gold jewelry that was found with the queen. Lots of ivory was brought back from especially the area of Syria and Phoenicia. The Phoenicians and the people who lived in what's now modern-day Syria, such as the Aramean states, were experts at carving ivory and turning it into beautiful objects. It's usually decorated wood furniture. Here you can see that throne room again that we talked about before. All right, let's look at some of the reliefs and see some of the things that are being depicted on them. Okay, in the throne room, the reliefs would usually commemorate the military victories. That way, any dignitaries or foreign visitors who were there would be awed and would be impressed and would be less likely to rebel. They were meant to intimidate. And we could also interpret some of the innovations of the Assyrian military in terms of warfare. For example, chariots. So in the late Bronze Age, chariots were the preeminent weapon. And in the beginning of the Iron Age, they still remain very important. Over time, they become less and less important. But the Assyrians did innovate the chariot, as we'll see. Most chariots were 2 horses and 2 men, a driver and an archer. The Assyrians were the first to create a 4-horse, 4-man chariot, which seems to have been quite an important weapon, although chariots are not very good in rough terrain. So the Assyrians were one of the first ones to, in the Middle East at least, to begin to use cavalry as horse-mounted troops rather than chariots. Here you can see a scene of usually the kings depicted as usual, larger than the other people. This is the execution of a prisoner here, and you can see the Assyrians attacking this walled city. At this point in time, many cities and many civilizations built large walls around their cities, and the Assyrians were experts at figuring out how to get over, through, or beyond these barricades. So the Assyrians became masters of siege warfare, as we're going to see. Right? Okay, here you can see decapitated soldiers and some of the Assyrian chariots over here. Yeah, so siege warfare became more and more important. And it really, the person behind the walls, the people in the city, were the ones who really had the advantage in general. But the Assyrians became so good at siege warfare that they were able to conquer a number of cities, numerous cities. And you can see here some of the techniques they would use, such as ladders. They would have heavily armored people come and actually you can see these metal spades, try and knock a hole in the wall. They also had these siege towers. These siege towers had archers on the top. They also had this kind of battering ram that would be used to pry loose some of the bricks in the wall and make a hole in the wall that the troops could then go into. You can see the defenders here have a chain, and they're trying to break the battering ram over here. Also in Nimrud, they depicted the prisoners that were captured, as well as you can see up here, the different kinds of goods like elephant ivory or hippopotamus ivory that was captured. And you could also see scribes. Scribes are ones who would keep the records and keep the accounts of all of this. Typically, when you see an Assyrian who is not bearded, many people interpret them as eunuchs. We know that eunuchs were used in the Assyrian Empire as servants of the king. We'll talk more about that as well. Also, the Assyrians were good at campaigning in many different environments. Right? So this is the Assyrians attacking a city down the river. Here's the city over here, and the enemy fleeing were forced to cross the river. And you can see they're using an improvised. Well, at that point, it seems improvised, but they were using a kind of flotation device that was used back then. And essentially, this is an animal skin that was inflated. Here you can see one still being sold today next to the Tigris in Iraq. So, this is essentially all the fur has been removed. It's kind of the internal part of the of the animal that then can be inflated like a balloon, and you can hold on to it, and it would take you across the river. And the Assyrian soldiers would carry these as well in case they had to ford rivers, part of their conquest. And other parts of the palace were more private, that maybe the king would only see. It wasn't, let's say, a lot of those military campaigns were not depicted. Instead, it was banquet scenes or scenes that were ritual. Here you can see the king is dining, and he's being attended to by 2 eunuch servants, and they're using these kind of horsehair whisks to keep the flies off of him. Here we can see Assur-Nasir-Pal double, right? 2 images of him, one on either side of this sacred tree, with probably the god Shamash. It looks like the solar god up here, as well as these kind of divine figures behind Assur-Nasir-Pal. Let's look at some of the ivories that were also found in Nimrud. Many of the ivories are Phoenician in style. We believe that if the ivories were made in Nimrud, they were probably made with labor that was brought over from the area of Syria, or they were looted from Syria. Again, many of them are finely made, very nicely decorated, that show a mixture of different artistic styles, usually blends Egyptian motifs with motifs from Phoenicia or other parts of Mesopotamia. So this is an Egyptian-style sphinx, but it's not like the Egyptian sphinxes that you would see in Egypt. Another common theme was this woman looking out of a window motif that you see in a lot of the ivory. You also see depictions like this, usually involving plants, solar discs, and people. And many of these plaques were used to decorate furniture, as we said before. Okay, some of the improvements to siege warfare, we've already seen some of them, but let's look in more detail at some of the techniques. We looked at those siege towers, those rams, right? They were usually wheeled vehicles that were protected by leather with these heavy battering rams, usually tipped with bronze or something like that, that would be used to either knock down the doors of the gates of the city or pry off bricks to create a hole. You can see people storming the walls on ladders as well, and the whole time archers are using what we would call in the military suppressive fire to keep the defenders on the wall at bay. Here you can see another depiction of one of those mobile towers or battering rams, and this is kind of a close-up where you can see some of these what are called sappers, who would be well protected from the arrows with all of their scale armor, who would try and chisel a hole in the wall. Okay, the Assyrians, another Assyrian innovation in terms of warfare was to have a standing army, to not just have a core group of officers and men, and then call up conscripts during the off-season of the agricultural cycle, but actually to have large numbers of people in the army that would be ready at a moment's notice all year round to fight. So while many civilizations could only fight in large numbers at certain times of the year, usually after the harvest, the Assyrians could fight during any time of the year, not just the summer, but the winter, the spring, the fall, right? So they were always ready. They could also fight in different terrains, as we've talked about before. So a standing professional army. They also would incorporate different captured peoples into the military. And sometimes those captive peoples were experts at a certain kind of warfare or a certain type of weapon. And they would be integrated into the army as ethnic units specialized in that kind of warfare. So the army expanded through captured people. They also restructured the administration, so limiting the power of officials increasing the power of the king, centralizing power, as we've seen before in other empires, reducing the power of local leaders. Also, they would appoint eunuchs as governors of territories. Eunuchs can't have children, obviously, so there's no pressure on them to pass down their position to their son, and their only loyalty could be to the king of Assyria. So that was a way to put someone in charge of a territory who would only be loyal to you. And Tiglath-Pileser also expanded this territory of Assyria. We talked about the 4-man, 4-horse chariot. So this is just showing the men in the chariot. You would have 2 people with shields, a driver, and someone with a bow and arrow. And the 2 shield bearers would protect the other 2 individuals. So it was much better protection for people than the 2-man chariot, where you had one person driving and one person shooting a bow and arrow, and no one carrying a shield really to protect anyone. As we said before, with the greater and greater use of iron, the Assyrians were able to equip their soldiers with more armament. So you actually had soldiers with body armor and helmets. Right? They were the first army to essentially wear, we would call them combat boots today, but boots that would be used in warfare, so they could again fight in many different kinds of terrain. Here you can see the Assyrian crossing the river with a goat skin like we saw before. They could fight in the woods, they could fight in the marshes, they could fight in the mountains, they could fight in the deserts. And here you can see the beginnings of cavalry, as we talked before. There was also the use of terror tactics, that is, using extraordinary measures to inspire fear into the enemies. And to dissuade them from rebelling against you. And this would include beheadings, flaying people alive, burning people alive, etc. Right? And these things, rather than hide these things, they depicted them on the walls of their throne room to scare off foreign dignitaries. Now, some people think that maybe this was a little bit of an exaggeration and maybe didn't occur as much in reality as it did in artwork. There's some debate about that. And as we said, another way of controlling people was through mass deportations, moving a number of people from one area to one territory and then moving another group of people back into that territory, right? So essentially switching people. And this would kind of discombobulate the population. They would be strangers, in a strange land. And they could be more easily controlled because they would sort of be disoriented. And the Assyrians would set them up in new territories and new villages and force them to work and farm new land. Right? And a really famous example of this are the 10 lost tribes of Israel. You might have heard of the 10 lost tribes of Israel. Well, during the Neo-Assyrian Empire, this is when we start to see the kingdoms of Israel and Judah appear, right? So we have King David, we have King Solomon. It's really after Solomon when the kingdom of Solomon divides into 2 is when we're into the Neo-Assyrian time period. And at a certain point, people from the northern kingdom of Israel, or what was known as Samaria, rebelled against the Neo-Assyrian Empire, and Sargon II brought people from Samaria back into northern Mesopotamia, and then brought people from Mesopotamia into Samaria. Now, these new peoples, right, that were deported into Samaria, decided to adopt the local god, Yahweh, of this territory. And these people became the Samaritans. And so when you read about the Good Samaritan in the New Testament, they're talking about this group of people that descend from people from northern Mesopotamia who were brought by Assyrians into this area and basically adopted the local religion. The 10 tribes, at least according to the legend, were brought back to somewhere in the Assyrian Empire, and over time they became assimilated into the population and quote-unquote disappeared. Right? There's a lot of debate about that, but that's sort of the way the story goes for a long period of time. Right? So any labor shortage that they felt, they just would fill that labor shortage through forced labor through the areas that they conquered. Okay, let's take a little look at the capital of Sargon now. So we saw a little bit about Nimrud. Let's take a little look at the capital of Sargon, Fortress of Sargon, modern name Khorsabad. Sargon II builds a new capital called Fortress of Sargon. But when he dies in battle, really only a few years later, I think less than a decade, the capital is abandoned because dying in battle is seen as a very bad omen, and his son builds a new capital at Nineveh. So the palaces at Khorsabad at Dur-Sharrukin were not used for very long. But let's look at some of the things that were found. Very similar to what we saw at Nimrud. This was built specifically for Sargon II. Right? You can see the entryway into one of the areas of the palace and some of the reliefs. This is excavations by the Oriental Institute of the University of Chicago that took place in the 1930s. And this lamassu that was discovered is actually now in the museum in the Oriental Institute. Unfortunately, because of COVID, we weren't able to go as a class to the Oriental Institute this year. I hope you will get the chance to go at some point. Who knows, and maybe I can take the Anthropology Club or something like that there in the future. But it's a really interesting museum. I'll show you a few pictures from some of the Assyrian galleries. But you can see when they found this winged bull, I think I mentioned this before, they told the museum back in Chicago to not complete the new building that they were constructing for the museum because they had to get this thing in. And if they completed it, they would never fit it in through the door. So they actually had to stop construction, move this huge lamassu in to the museum, and then finish that back wall. And this is what it looks like now in the Oriental Institute, with these stone reliefs, still with some paint on them, and that one of those enormous lamassu. This depicts as the crown prince, the son of Sargon II, Sennacherib, who becomes the next king. And so after Dur-Sharrukin is abandoned, Sennacherib builds probably the most famous capital of the Assyrians, that is Nineveh, near the Tigris. And he actually mounted this enormous hydraulic construction campaign to build these canals to bring water from the mountains down onto the plain behind Nineveh. So these were miles and miles in length, a lot like the later Roman aqueducts. Some people think that the construction of that kind of size and scale didn't exist before Rome, but we see it in the Assyrian Empire. You can see some of the remnants of this Chariot aqueduct that actually brought water from down here all the way to Nineveh. Right, so this new capital of Nineveh was constructed and populated, and labor was imported, and agricultural infrastructure was created to support it. Not all the water went for agriculture. The inscriptions of Sennacherib describe that there were elaborate parks and gardens designed to look like the weather landscapes of Anatolia and Babylonia, which probably Babylon was also being fed by this canal system. So we really get an idea, a sense of opulence here. And you can see from the satellite photos, we're going to be talking about more evidence that comes from satellite photos, but you can see clearly the canal from the satellite photos. So for almost 200 kilometers, they integrated feeder canals that then led into this larger canal system that brought the water right to Nineveh. This implies that there was broad control over a large territory, and obviously organization of labor, and also centralized planning. You would think that this had to exist for this kind of construction to come about. As we saw again, the conquered peoples being deported. Is there any evidence of that in the settlement patterns in the provinces? Well, archaeologists have begun to work in the areas outside of the capital cities to look at how things change through time. And one thing that they do notice is in the area of kind of the around Nineveh, what they see is a large increase in the number of sites. They can also see increase in the sites in other parts of their conquered territories as well. So this is northern Syria, called the Balik Valley. This is another part of northern Syria, right? This is area around Nineveh. This is kind of the area that's near Anatolia. So you can see overall an increase in the number of sites. They're filling in the landscape with deported people, it looks like, because this does not look like just natural population growth. So the description of deportations that occur in the text is backed up by the archaeology, which shows that, yes, in fact, this was happening because we could see it on the ground, and we can see it in the massive increase in the number of sites. We also see it in how they're setting people up, where they're actually putting them to live. We see kind of a structured landscape, right? So, for example, we talked about those holloways in the period of of the Akkadian period, right? Where those holloways showed that people from different important sites are going out and working their fields and then going back to the main sites at night, and they were intensively using certain parts of the land. But when you look at that early Bronze Age, around the Akkadian period, they were intensively using these portions of the land, but they weren't uniformly distributing sites across the area to maximize the use of every acre of farmable land in the territory, which is exactly what the Assyrians did, right? That is, you can see kind of nucleated settlements. And then in the Neo-Assyrian period, it looks like the settlements are evenly spread across the landscape. This is an imposed settlement pattern. They're setting people up and putting them in these places to maximize, it looks like, to maximize the production, agricultural production of the land. And with this huge, and also rather than having cities, it's easier to control them in these smaller hamlets and smaller villages. So it really looks like this deportation policy, that there's real archaeological evidence for it. Okay, so in terms of imposed landscape rather than emergent landscape, this is a kind of a dichotomy that archaeologists use. The holloways, right? People basically just using these paths over and over, going out back their fields. It's unconscious. It's not necessarily deliberate. That's kind of a landscape that emerges from people using them. Whereas building large canals and to bring water from over very long distances is really kind of an imposed landscape of an empire. Okay, we'll stop here for this week. Next week we'll finish up talking about the Assyrian Empire and briefly discuss some of the later empires.